Hello, everybody. I am reading the Gammage Cup. We're going to read the next couple chapters. I am reading it in honor of my sixth grade teacher who passed away in December of last year. She read this book to us when we were in sixth grade. She was a huge part of my reason for becoming a teacher. So I am reading it on the live stream in her honor for the chapter. Chapter 6. When you say what you think, be sure to think what you say. Muggles Maxims. The village was astir at dawn the next morning. By order of the mayor, Splash the painter and his sons were set to work mixing great vats of lime and water for whitewash, and smaller vats of flax oil and green pigment with which to cover every door in the village. Thatch the roofer climbed briskly over the top of the mayor's house, replacing the dried reed where it was needed, and trimming the shaggy overhanging fringe into neat scallops. Blaze the firefighter was appointed to the new post of village pruner and went from family tree to family tree, trimming and whacking. In the baker's shop, Loaf experimented with a new recipe for making cakes, while Dingle the Meller ground the special reed plant finer than it had ever been ground before, and then ground it over again until he was whiter than he had ever been before. Slipper on the Water hummed like a hive. Muggles hummed right along with the rest of the village, but as she dismantled her heaps, dusted the articles, and carefully built them up again into tidier piles, she stopped frequently to look out the window. It's none of my business, and I'd best stay out of it, she told herself each time. He's probably missed lots of meetings, and nobody ever noticed before. But by the middle of the morning, when the inside of her cottage was neat and tidy with all the piles resorted, Muggles slipped outside. Gummy's house had a closed, secretive look, and anyway, she had no intention of exposing herself to Ko's wrath by going there. Instead, she set off for the riverbank where she had found Gummy 2 days ago. But though she walked fearfully along the strip of woods as far as the little trickle, she found no sign of Gummy. Perplexed and uneasy, she walked back toward the dock. Only then did it occur to her to look for Gummy's boat. Hastening her steps, she scanned the boats tied up along the bank. The bright yellow craft was missing. At first, she felt relief. Gummy had only gone off on one of his expeditions. Then a new uneasiness seized her. Supposing he had gone to the mountains. Suppose nothing, she said shortly. For all I know, Gummy is missing most of the time. He's completely undependable. I wash my hands of him. And she went back to the marketplace to claim her share of the paint. As the day wore on and the cottages gleamed whiter and whiter, and their doors greener and greener, more and more often the villagers turned from their work to glance speculatively at the scarlet door that fronted on the marketplace. It remained scarlet. In fact, the more green paint that was splashed about on the other doors, the more scarlet Curly Green's door seemed to become. One of Splash's sons turned up with a ladder in mid-afternoon and coated the walls of her house with whitewash. But when he had finished and been paid by Curly Green, who appeared briefly to inspect his work, the door was still scarlet. At last, just before tea time, that scarlet door, now watched by everybody within spying distance, opened, and Curly Green emerged with a pot of paint and a brush. A collective sigh went up, so heartfelt that it sounded like a wind in the trees, and Curly Green began to paint her door. She painted it scarlet. Aang, the wife of Geo, stared open-mouthed across the marketplace and then turned to Muggles, who was whitewashing her own house in order to save her scarce gold pieces. Do you see what she is doing? It's her door, said Muggles, and got down to move her mended stool to another spot. But the Gammage Cup, cried Aang, wringing her hands. What will the judges think? Muggles turned round to face Aang. Queer, she had never before realized how much alike all the periods looked. Perhaps, she said slowly, perhaps the judges will like it. Aang came as close as she ever would to being speechless. Who ever heard of a mini-pin liking anything but a green door? It's ridiculous. Well, Muggles got up on her stool again. She knew that she had best agree with Aang and let it go at that, but a small voice inside her head goaded her. Go on, it said. Go on and say it. Well, Muggles said again. Well, that's not quite true. I mean, you must admit that Curly Green at least prefers scarlet, else she wouldn't paint her door that color. And she hesitated and swallowed nervously. And she swallowed once more, then gasped out, I like it myself. In a gesture of defiance, she splotted her brush in a paint of whitewash and began spreading it on the wall in great swipes. She could feel Aang's unbelieving eyes boring into her, but she set her lips in a stubborn line. For the first time since she could remember, she had told a period exactly what she thought, instead of what they thought she ought to think. At last, the long day of scrubbing and polishing and painting was over. When brush appeared to give the cobblestones their nightly sweeping, folks walked about the square, admiring their shining village, calling out to each other in tired, happy voices. Muggle slipped over to the museum to see that all was in order, but she had no more than got inside when Walter the Earl appeared in the doorway. There was a suppressed air of excitement about him. "Muggles!" he burst out. "When the fool's balloon crashed and everything got scattered, how did the villagers know what was what when they picked the things up?" They matched them with Fooley's list, the list he'd made in his book. "Just so. Now look here." He whipped a scroll from under his arm, opened it with a snap to show the circles and squares and shields. "What do you think this is?" "Why, it's the painting I saw at your house." Muggles glanced uneasily past him. "Don't you think you'd better close the door?" Bother the door. Just look at this." He pointed to the inscription that ran along the top of the scroll. "That says, the family tree of the ancient line of the Earls of the Golden Mountain. Do you hear that? The family tree. It's the history of a family." He pointed a scornful finger at the wall where the picture of the willow tree hung. "That is not the family tree." But But what is it?" Muggles asked, bewildered. "It's a painting!" Walter the Earl's voice rose triumphantly. "The villagers made a mistake because they had never heard of a family tree. They didn't know a painting was just another name for a blob." He stalked over to the wall. "What are you going to do?" Muggles asked in alarm. "Put things right. Correct the mistake. What else?" With a jerk, he removed the name placards from beneath the two frames and switched them. "Put those back!" commanded a furious voice. Muggles whirled round in fright. There, standing in the doorway, and white with rage, was the town clerk. "Oh," Muggles gasped. She shrank away as Ko advanced threateningly into the room. "Put those back," he repeated, "and I'll take that trumped-up scroll you're flourishing so grandly." Walter the Earl stared at him for a moment, and then, with great deliberation, he stuck the parchment in his belt and folded his arms defiantly over it. "Very well." Ko folded his own arms over his important paunch. "You will answer to the Council of Periods for this. As town clerk, I now declare the museum closed to you. You will leave at once." Trembling, Muggles watched Walter the Earl stride out the door, his fearless figure quite unbent by Ko's scathing looks. "Now then, Muggles," said Ko in a kinder voice, "will you please me by restoring those placards to their rightful places?" But they are..." Muggles' protest died before the ice in Ko's eyes. Yes, Ko." "And now, Muggles," he said when she had done as he ordered, "I am not going to ask you to explain this." And he opened his hand to disclose a sticky, somewhat sucked minty pin. "It is clear that Walter the Earl put you up to it." Muggles stiffened. "Oh, no, he didn't. It was my idea." Ko's eyebrows crawled up his forehead. "Yes?" Her courage suddenly failed her. "I'm sorry, Ko," she said humbly. "That's better." Ko gave her a soothing pat. "We don't blame you, Muggles. You've been led astray. Now I suggest you stay here quietly among these venerable objects and think things over." Muggles would have preferred to think in her own cozy cottage, but she didn't dare go against Ko's orders. So she stared hard at the family tree and the painting, or, according to Walter the Earl, at the painting and the family tree, until the daylight had quite gone. When she left the museum at last, Ect had already performed the ritual of striking fire to the reed light. Muggles hurried past it on the far side to escape its fumes. The marketplace was empty, except for herself and a sodden, muddy figure staggered from the street going to the river into the square. He wavered a few steps further, and then, with a little cry, fell into a heap and did not rise. "Gummy!" Muggles flew across the cobblestones to the huddled of yellow cloak. "Gummy, is it really you?" He gave a groan and rolled over to stare glassily at the burning reed. "Ect had a little light," he mumbled. "Ect lit a little light, and now we've got it every night. It may burn orange as new quince jelly, but let's admit, it's rather smelly. Hush, said Muggles, looking fearfully over her shoulder. What happened to you? Where have you been? Gummy's eyes flickered shut and then open again. Fell overboard, coming home from the mountains. Almost didn't make it. Been keeping watch last 2 nights. Did you? What did you? Gummy! She gave him a little shake as his eyes began to close again. Pocket. Right hand pocket. Quickly, Muggles searched first one pocket, then the other. No, there's nothing, Gummy. What was it? Gummy gave a groan. Must have fallen out into the river. Just a half-burned twig. Half-burned twig? Cried Muggles. But what? It blew off the mountain. She stared at him. Brought it home to prove It doesn't matter. Wouldn't believe, anyway. Muggles half pulled, half carried Gummy inside her house. After she had wrapped him in her comforter and given him some soup and 2 cups of strong hot tea, he promptly fell asleep, curled up on her bed. Muggles stood looking down at his white, drawn face for a few minutes. Not altogether undependable after all, she thought. Just depends on what you're depending on. Chapter 7. Curly had a little door. Its color was bright scarlet. It blazoned forth both night and day by sun and moon and starlit, till one dark night. Whim. Uncompleted poem. It was fully dark now, except for Echt's reed light. Muggles blew out the candle and huddled before her fire, where she could keep watch on the distant sunset mountains through the window. Like fish being handed from a fishing boat and counted, her worries flopped one by one into her mind. Curly Green's scarlet door, the mutterings against Walter the Earl, Coe's visit to the museum, the secret of the treasures in the vault, the words of the 17th Earl. It is my belief that such a one will appear when he is needed for the safety of his people. And underneath all these nagging, torturous worries lay the biggest one of all, that she hardly dared look at: the fires on the mountains. Fires on the mountains! Things, people out there spying down upon the valley, trying to get in. Gummy said that they couldn't come over the Sunset Mountains, but how could he be sure? They had gone up the other side, hadn't they? And even if they couldn't come over the cliffs at that place, who was to say there weren't other spots further up the valley open to them? Muggles shuddered. A small secret a small secret furtive sound on the still night air brought her upright. Who would be in the marketplace at this hour? Forcing herself to stand up, she went to her door and softly opened it. There were no lights visible in any of the cottages, and the reed light in the center of the marketplace had settled down to a soft glow, but there was enough illumination to make out a cloaked figure hurrying across the square. Muggles' eyes widened. It was certainly Geo, and he was carrying something. She stood and watched to see what he was about, while her wonderment changed to indignation. When Geo at last returned across the marketplace, Muggles quietly closed her door and leaned against it, thinking hard. Then, her lips set in a determined line, she lit the candle and stole across the room to extract the things she needed from various heaps and piles. When all was in readiness, she swung her door open and set to work. At last she was finished, and she stepped back with a pleased smile. It was even more glorious than she had expected. She put her materials carefully away where they belonged and sat down before the fire again. And though she was trembling a bit at her daring, the corners of her mouth curved into a satisfied smile. Chapter 8. When something happens, something else always happens. Muggles' Maxims. When the sun got up the next morning, Thatch had already placed his ladder against Fooley Hall and climbed up on the roof to start work. With his bundle of dried reeds on his back, he crawled along, whistling softly around the clove of garlic he always sucked at as a remedy against chills, and counting in his head the number of gold pieces he would have by the end of the week. When he reached the chimney, he stood up to survey the roofs still to be done in the newly scalloped fringe, 1 gold bit for each. It was an encouraging sight, and Thatch's heart swelled with happiness. Roofs to the north of him, roofs to the west of him, roofs to the... Perplexed, Thatch turned back to scan the houses on the west side of the marketplace. What was different about them this morning? What? He clutched the chimney in astonishment. Curly Green's door was as green as the greenest door on the square. Well, said Thatch, shifting the garlic from one cheek to the other. He swept his gaze around the marketplace, at the rows of shining white houses and uniform green doors. Then he clutched the chimney again, his eyes almost popping out of his head. Across the square from Curly Green's door glowed a splotch of bright color. Fetch blinked and blinked again. It was Muggles's house, and her door was painted a vivid orange. "Well," said Thatch, and gaped so broadly that his garlic fell out and rolled down the roof unheeded. Other folk had more to say when they discovered the changes wrought during the night. Small groups clustered together on the cobbles to whisper and glance sidelong at the two doors, broke up and reclustered to whisper some more. Somebody, no one knew who, started a rumor going that Geo, the official village painter, knew more about Curly Green's painted door than Curly Green herself. When this news circulated itself amongst the clusters, there was a sound like a gobble of fish snapping at green flies. Reedy, the basket maker's wife, was indignant. "Right or wrong," said she, "it's Curly Green's door, and Geo has no business meddling with it behind her back." Bun, the baker's wife, was more cautious. "But Geo being a period. Now, if it was somebody ordinary like Dingle or Spill or Thatch that did the painting, we should know at once that it was wrong. But with Geo being a period, well, there's a difference, Reedy." "That's right, there's a difference," Wove the Weaver agreed. "Periods know what is right and what is wrong," said Dingle the Miller solemnly. "It has always been that way. Don't the periods hold the high offices because of their wisdom?" "Yes, yes," everybody agreed. The question settled, the clusters began to break up, but just then there was a new diversion. The door of Gummy's house opened, and Gummy stepped outside. Instantly, every eye was riveted on him. He set a pail down on his doorstone. With a carefree air, he produced a brush, dabbed it in the pail, cocked his head from side to side, and then, raising the dripping brush, he applied a broad stroke of yellow paint to his door. On the west side of the square, Walter the Earl stepped out of on his doorstone and methodically began to paint his own door bright blue. The tense silence of the waiting villagers broke into a into a concerted gasp. "How dare they?" cried Bun. "The periods will never stand for it." "Stand for what?" demanded Scott, the town clerk's wife. She and Eng, followed by Wim and Geo, pushed their way through the excited cluster. "If it's poor simple Muggles and her door, you needn't concern yourselves." For answer, Finn Longtooth pointed first at Gummy's house, then at Walter the Earl's. "Why, those—" Geo started forward, his face aflame. Wim held on to him. "Littid said no more fuss," he warned. "But they're cheating us of the Gammage Cup with every stroke," Eng cried shrilly. The ordinary villagers, jolted by this new thought, began to grumble in indignation. "Shouldn't be allowed, then," Finn Longtooth declared. "Now I remember when there was a bit of trouble over cutting down a family tree." "Of course it's their doors," Reedy pointed out. "But it's our village," cried Bun. "They shouldn't be allowed to spoil our village." Geo suddenly turned and made off for the mayor's house. Ignoring his audience, Gummy covered the last bit of his door with paint and stepped back to admire the effect. Then he took his pail and brush and himself inside. Walter the Earl had already disappeared behind his bright blue door. Unaware of these happenings, Muggles was just getting up. The night's vigil had been long and unrewarding, for there were no fires to be seen on the mountains, and at dawn she had fished an old comforter from the under-the-table heap and made a cozy bed by the fire. When she woke up, Gummy had gone, leaving on her table a scribble. "For picking me up and taking me in, for cheating the mice of nibbling my chin, thanks. For the use of your bed and the soup and the tea, may you never regret what you've done for me. Thanks." "I hope I won't," Muggles murmured. She made herself a pot of watercress tea and 3 fish cakes, and after restoring the old comforter to its proper place and otherwise making her house neat and tidy, she ventured forth. The brightness of her door as she swung it open made her wince. It was very orange by daylight. Still, nobody seemed to be bothering his head about it. She struck straight across the marketplace toward the museum. A lot of villagers were clustered round the lamppost where Geo was putting up a hastily lettered sign. Muggles paused on the fringe of the crowd to read it. Notice: first spring meeting after tea. Important. With 3 sharp raps of his tap hammer, Geo nailed the notice securely to the post. "And now," he crowed, stepping back, "we'll see about them." Exciting. Chapter 9. You never can tell from a mini pin's hide what color he is deep down inside. Gummy, Scribbles, Collected Works. There was no loitering over tea and slipper on the water that afternoon. Fish cakes and watercress were downed in a hurry. Dishes washed even more hurriedly, and then, snatching up their stools, the villagers made their way to the marketplace to talk in whispering groups until time for the meeting to begin. Only Muggles remained inside her house. In one hand, she held her ordinary brown sash, in the other, her orange. She would have to decide very soon. There was a stir in the marketplace, and then the buzz of voices hushed. Litid had just emerged from the mayor's house and was walking in stately slowness across to the meeting house. The brown or the orange? Muggles peered out her window at the slowly moving throng following Litid. Sorry. Like a patch of sunset sky, Curly Green's scarlet cloak flamed at the doorway of the meeting house beside Minji's patched green, and then was swallowed up. Muggles dropped one of the sashes on the floor and hurried out into the marketplace. When Curly Green and Minji slipped into the gloom of Fooley Hall, they placed their stools neatly in line with the others already there, and went up to the table to receive steaming mugs of watercress punch and biscuits. But when they went back to their places, the stools which had been beside theirs had been pointedly removed, while the row behind was filling up rapidly. "Good," said Minji, not looking at Curly Green. "Plenty of elbow room. Hate being crowded. Folks crunching biscuits in your ear so you can't hear your own crunches." Curly Green looked troubled. "Don't sit with me, Minji," she said in a whisper. "Sit where I please," Minji snapped and folded his arms. Gummy and Walter the Earl threaded their way through the press of villagers a moment later and plumped their stools down beside Curly Green's in the almost empty row. "Good of you to save us some space," said Walter the Earl sardonically. Muggles arrived breathless, her hastily tied orange sash askew. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, putting her stool down next to Minji. "Have a peppermint, do." And she passed a crumpled bag of sweets down the line. Minji took one with a scowl. "Why don't you be sensible and sit somewhere else?" "Because this is where I belong," said Muggles with a simple dignity. In a few moments, Fooley Hall was full, and everybody had been helped to steaming mugs of punch and biscuits. But instead of the usual gay chatter of voices, a curious silence descended, broken only by a nervous whisper here and there. There was no need to rap the wall for order, but Litid rapped it anyway. The last whisper stopped abruptly. "Good folk," said the mayor. "We have plans to make for receiving the 3 judges when they come. They may arrive any day now." There was clapping of hands, and Litid smiled round at his audience. "Free paint has already been distributed to everybody, and I want to thank you for the promptness with which you have painted your cottages." The clapping was more sporadic this time. Veiled glances were aimed in the direction of the 6th row of stools, where gold and scarlet, yellow and orange intermingled, and there was an uneasy rattle of the money box. "You have seen the excellent work already done by Thatch. He will continue until every roof in Slipper on the Water has a scalloped fringe, and roofing will be paid for out of the money box." Loud and prolonged applause greeted this statement. Minji scowled and stood up. "Then I must warn the assembled company that this raid on the money box will leave the village poor for the rest of the year." Ko leapt to his feet. "I should like to ask our money keeper just what he proposes to do with the village wealth. Stack it up in big piles and put it in the museum for everybody to look at?" Minji's face turned red. "I propose to spend it sensibly," he retorted, "not on fancying up the village to win prizes. What good will scalloped roofs do if the dock suddenly caves in when the judges arrive? And then there's the sick fund. We need a sick fund to take care of folk when they have bad luck or can't work. What will the judges think if they see some of our villagers starving themselves for lack of a gold piece?" A murmur of approval started up, but it was quickly quelled by Wim. "As to that," he cried, "I am sick of hearing about Minji's sick fund. It's pure foolishness, as I can show in one moment. Is there anybody here who's starving to death?" There were mutters of no and of course not, although Spill the candlemaker and a few others stirred uncomfortably on their stools. Spill's candles were more costly to make than X reed lights, and he was feeling the pinch. Bros popped up to speak. "It's clear enough that Minji doesn't want us to win the Gammage Cup, along with several others." He darted a venomous look at the outcast row. "I say, let's get on with the meeting, for the sake of the rest of us who do." "Very well," said Litid. "The meeting is thrown open for suggestions as to what more may be done to our village that will help us to win the Gammage Cup." Geo sprang up. "Green doors," he burst out. "Everybody should have a green door. It spoils the appearance of the village if folks are going to paint their doors any old color they please." And green cloaks, his wife Anne cried. Proper, decent, mini-pin green cloaks for everybody, so we'll not feel ashamed. Yes, said Litted. The matter of color. He stroked his beard with nervous fingers. I am going to make an appeal to certain members of our village. He fixed the row of gold and scarlet, yellow and orange with a stern eye. Now then, there seems to be a difference of opinion about what color is proper to a mini-pin's door and a mini-pin's cloak. Don't forget Walter the Earl's sword, cried Geo. And the candy warriors Muggles made, cried Scott. And what they're saying about the family tree. This was from Geo and Wim together. Litted held up his hand for silence. We won't go into that for the moment. The question right now is, shall we all have green doors and green cloaks, which are traditional with mini pins? Or, Walter the Earl, do you wish to address the meeting? Walter the Earl kept his hands folded over his ash plant and pushed himself to his feet. I painted my door blue because I objected to someone's sneaking out at night and painting Curly Green's door without her consent or knowledge. I wear my gold embroidered cloak because it suits me. My family was a family of warriors, and in the old days, long before they came to this valley, they wore the gold with pride. History. Fact history, not fool history. Ko gave an excited shout. There! You see? He's insulting Fooly! Fooly's name was properly the Fool while he lived, said Walter the Earl coldly. I see no reason for changing it now. There were cries of indignation all over the hall. Several periods jumped to their feet with fierce shouts. Litted banged hard on the wall. Gummy? With a flowing motion, Gummy stood up. When the sun is shining on the trees, dappling the green with golden ease, and spring is bursting in every part, I must wear yellow o'er my heart. He made a very deep bow and sat down again. There was a heavy silence. Curly Green, said Litted with a sigh. She got up slowly and looked about at all the familiar faces in the hall. I'm sorry, she said softly. I'm sorry that my door seems to have caused all this trouble. I hadn't realized that it was so offensive to everybody. I even thought, but I suppose this is silly, I thought that there were some folks who enjoyed looking at my door. Thatch suddenly straightened himself. Well, he began, but then his tongue got tangled up with the garlic clove in his mouth, and before he could get it popped back into his cheek, his voice was drowned out. Not likely, snorted Aang. An eyesore on the whole village, said Geo. Poor excuse. More impudence. Litted made a banging sound and nodded to Muggles, who turned white and then pink with embarrassment as she wobbled to her feet. I don't know much about things, she faltered, but, well, it seems to me. She stopped short and looked around for rescue, but there was nobody to help her out. Then she caught Curly Green's eye, and Curly Green smiled at her. What I mean is, she went on, well, I don't think it's doors or cloaks or orange sashes. It's us. What I mean is, it's no matter what color we paint our doors or what kind of clothes we wear, we're those colors inside us. Instead of being green inside, you see, like other folk. So I don't think maybe it would do any good if we just changed our outside color. We would still be orange or scarlet inside. And well, we would do orange and scarlet things all the time, and everybody would still. Really, said Aang. She is simple. Yes, I know, Muggles agreed. Everybody always says so. But what I really want to say is, wouldn't it be cheating if we changed our outsides just for the judges? I mean, it doesn't seem quite fair, does it? She tried to think of something more to explain, but her brain was already dizzy from its exertion. She sat down. Good sense, Minji said suddenly. Most sense I've heard today. Me, I like green. Good, sensible color, doesn't show dirt. Don't have to wash it to pieces, waste soap and water. How would I like it if somebody came along and said I had to wear yellow now? Wouldn't do it. Don't know what color I am inside. Don't think I'm green, though. Probably a good, sensible brown. Doesn't show the dirt. But whatever color it is, I'm not going to change it for all the judges in the land between the mountains. Villagers exchanged bewildered glances. One or two shuffled their feet as though they would rise and speak, but each waited for the other, and by that time, the official village painter had the floor. I've never heard so much nonsense, Geo sputtered. Ridiculous. All this chatter about folks being green inside, or orange, or scarlet. Ridiculous, I say. We've put up with them long enough, Wim cried. Them and their blobs and scribbles and history, they teach our children bad things, interrupted Scott. And only yesterday, said Geo, Co caught them tampering with the museum. Tampering with the museum, somebody said in a shocked voice. That's right, Geo said triumphantly. They will do anything. Anything. He dropped his voice down almost to a whisper. Good folks, you know what happens to a gobble of fish when a lamprey enters the river. Unless it is found and cast out, the fish disappear one by one. He paused, and everybody hung breathless on his words. It is plain to see that we now have 5 lampreys in our village. Every minute that these lampreys spend with us from now on is a minute of danger. Lampreys! Fin Longtooth gasped and turned white. Lampreys, echoed the villagers, and those sitting near that row of bright colors cringed away from it. The town clerk now rose to his feet and faced the assemblage. Am I right in thinking that all of you want the Gammage Cup to come to Slipper on the Water? Yes, the villagers shouted with one accord. And am I right in believing that you trust the periods, your own periods in your own village, to do all they can to get it for you? Yes! Then, Co intoned, we must take action against these troublemakers, these destroyers. He paused for a deep breath. They must be outlawed. For a second, there was silence in the hall. Then came a horrific sucking in of breath from the assembly. Not to live in a village securely surrounded by neighbors. A Minipin could hardly even imagine such a thing. No one had ever been outlawed. It was the worst of all punishments, written down in the law books, but never used. The dreadful word went whispering around the hall. Outlawed. Outlawed. Litted rapped for order. He looked unhappy. Now, my good people, we must think very carefully. That won't be necessary. Walter the Earl stood up straight and proud in his gold-embroidered cloak. We have no wish to set Minipins at odds with their conscience, nor do we intend to stand in the way of their winning of the Gammage Cup. We are not lampreys, but neither are we flies to be swallowed by trout. And so tomorrow morning we shall take leave of this village to settle elsewhere. In short, we are outlawing Slipper on the Water. Walter the Earl turned, and without a backward glance, walked from the meeting house. Curly Green and Gummy followed close behind. For a moment, Muggles and Mingy looked at each other, and then, in the awful waiting silence, they too rose and walked out. The money box remained behind on Mingy's stool. Chapter 10. No matter where there is, when you arrive, it becomes here. Muggles' Maxims. How much farther is it? Muggles panted, resting her paddle on the side of the heavily laden boat. Just around the bend, Gummy called over his shoulder. Keep paddling or you'll go backwards. It was late afternoon, and they were making their way in 5 boats up the little trickle toward the Sunset Mountains. It had been a day of hard toil and sadness and excitement, starting at sunup. When Muggles had rolled out of her feather bed and started reaching for her clothes, she hadn't remembered at first what was to be done that day. Then, when it came to her, she almost rolled back into bed to hide under the comforter. Could this really be happening to her, or was it all a bad dream? Bad dream, of course, she decided optimistically. Unthinkable that she could have got herself so mixed up with folks like Curly Green and Gummy, and at that moment there was a tap on her door. And when Muggles opened it and found Reedy and Bun on her doorstone, she knew that it hadn't been just a bad dream after all. We've come to help you pack, Reedy said stiffly, looking everywhere but Muggles. Thank you, Muggles faltered. You shouldn't. I know. That's exactly what Crambo said. Reedy, he said, you shouldn't get mixed up with orange doors and swords and the like. No good will come of it, he said. Fiddlesticks, Crambo, I said. If you want them out of the village, then the quickest way to remove them is to help them pack up. Crambo's cautious he is, but even he saw the sense of that. Her quick eyes darted around the room from pile to pile. My, what heaps of stuff you've got. You planning to take all of it? No, Muggle said. You can have anything you like after we've gone. Now that's what I call sensible. Reedy gave several brisk nods. Come on, Bun. Don't stand there gaping. There's work to be done. Muggles moved back before their advance and sank onto the stool Minji had mended for her. It was really happening then. Well, she was resigned to it, she thought with a sigh. Let them do to her belongings what they would. But as Reedy vigorously attacked the first pile, she gave a little choked cry and turned her head away. It had taken a long time. At first, in spite of Muggles' determination to let Reedy and Bud have their way with their treasures, there had been arguments over the packet of glitter stones. What use are they? Demanded Reedy. But they're so pretty, begged Muggles, all winking fire. Besides, they've always been in my family, or so I've heard. Over the pebbles with the magic properties. There is no such thing as magic, said Reedy. How can you be sure? Wailed Muggles. But in the end, Muggles retreated into numb silence while Reedy and Bun discarded her treasures with ruthless abandon. Even so, the take-along heap reached alarming proportions and would have to be sorted all over again had Gummy not promised to pick up the remaining pieces when he returned on the 5th day to bring back the 4 boats lent to the outlaws by vote of the Council of Periods. There was no sending forth party as the heavily laden craft set off, though more than one villager suddenly found that he had business which took him close to the dock. Loaf the baker discovered that he had accidentally mixed too large a batch of bread for the villagers' use, and thrust a basket full of loaves into Curly Green's hands. Dinklehead unaccountably found himself with too much flour and pressed a heavy bag of it upon them, lest it grow buggy in his mill. Reedy contributed a quantity of fresh reed butter and fish patties in payment for the articles bestowed upon her by Muggles, and Spill surreptitiously slipped a bundle of candles into Minji's boat, giving no reason at all for making such a gift. But most of the villagers stayed away, and the periods stayed even more away as the 5 boats cast off from the dock with Gummy in the lead. Muggles looked back just once as they rounded the bend. The dock was empty already, except for Reedy, who lifted her arm in a half-hearted wave of farewell. Then the bend cut the village from their view. A few minutes later, Gummy had turned his boat into the smaller waters of the little trickle. There was no time or breath for talking. The boats lay so heavy in the water that even Gummy, accustomed to paddling for long hours, was too winded to shout out the rhymes that gathered in his head. For hours they labored upstream under the lonely, trailing willow trees, with only the sound of paddles striking the water, the occasional soft plash of a curious trout, the whir of birds startled from their perches, and the soft, eerie stirrings of small animals along the banks. Once Muggle stopped paddling and looked wildly about at the strangeness closing in on her. What was she doing here in a boat, rushing off from the old comfortable sounds of slippers pattering on cobblestones, the busy bustle and rustle of the marketplace, the "Look out!" warned Curly Green from the boat behind her. "We're going to bump!" Muggle seized her paddles and plunged them into the water with a splash. "What's done is finished," she told herself sternly. "Put your nose ahead and your face will follow. You can't take a step without putting forth a foot. Look where you're going before you look back." But that was just the trouble. She didn't know where she was going. None of them did, except Gummy. Up the little trickle to a stone house on a knoll, he had described it. But where was that really? Where was anywhere once you had left the village? "Almost there," Gummy sang out and bent stronger to his paddle. A moment later, he pulled in beside a crude dock concealed by an immense willow tree. Scrambling out, he moored his craft to the trunk of the tree and turned to help Muggles out of her boat. Grassy banks dotted with blue and yellow flowers led upward from the stream to a knoll where tall trees sheltered a stone cottage with a woven willow roof. To the left of the knoll, the little trickle wound on to its source in the Sunset Mountains, only the peaks of which were visible through a break in the trees. The sun was already disappearing behind the crags in a fire of red and gold. Fire. Muggles shivered and looked back to the little stone cottage on the knoll. "Well," said Gummy. "It looks," said Muggles. "Why, it looks like somewhere." Then there was no time for more talk, for Curly Green's boat had to be docked, and Minji's, and last of all, Walter the Earl's. It took dozens of trips to carry all their supplies and small pieces of furniture up to the stone house. There were comforters and clothes, pots and stools, boxes and barrels and dishes. There were also 5 suits of armor, 5 jeweled war cloaks, 5 shields, 1 battle flag, and 5 swords. Minji scratched his head when these things came out of Walter the Earl's boat. "We gonna have a battle?" "You never know," Walter the Earl said stiffly, and turned away to see if his box of ancient parchments had come to any harm. Gummy's house was a haphazard collection of stones fetched from the rock outcroppings at the northern base of the knoll and slapped together with river clay. Tiny as it was, there was scarcely room to swing a turtle. It had been 2 years a building, but there was a chimney and a fireplace with a clay oven, and even some crude shelves to hold dishes. The roof of woven willow wands, Gummy announced proudly, scarcely leaked at all except on one side, and then only when it rained. He had never bothered to patch it after he discovered the convenience of having running water in the house. "And I suppose you just lie under the leak and open your mouth when you're thirsty?" said Curly Green. "Not me, thank you. I'll sleep on the other side of the room." But as more and more of the outlaw's possessions came through the door, the little house shrank alarmingly until there was scarcely room for all five to stand up in. Minchie stared morosely at the mounting heap of stuff. "Just where are we going to sleep?" "Outside," said Gummy cheerfully. "Outside!" cried Muggles, and "outside!" the others echoed. They stared at Gummy as though he had said that they would make their beds in the little trickle. "Outside," Gummy repeated with firmness. "It's a fine night, so why not? Animals sleep outside, don't they?" "When Gammage first came to the valley," Walter the Earl said thoughtfully, "they must have slept out in the open." "Then we sleep under the stars until we get another house built," said Minchie with a determined nod. "Won't say I relish the idea, but I dare say there'll be lots of new ideas we won't take to just at first. Thing to do is to be cheerful. Do the thing that has to be done. Don't look backwards." They spread their comforters and blankets under the trees, and then they sat cross-legged on the grass in the dying light and ate supper from the good things the villagers had tucked into the boats. The plash of the little trickle sounded faintly in their ears, and the tall trees waved overhead. "Tastes good," said Muggles. "Mmm." They settled down to their munching with sighs of contentment. "Picklick," Curly Green said suddenly. "What?" "Picklick." Curly Green swept her piece of bread in a wide arc. "I've just invented a new word. A it's what we're having now. A picklick. We pick around for what we want to eat, and then we lick our fingers." Gummy, his mouth full, bobbed his head vigorously. "That's good." He chewed hard, swallowed, took another bite, and then talked around it. "Picklick in the woods. Taste cool green air. Hear splash of brook. Feel spiders in hair. Picklick in meadow. Watch butterflies flutter. See sun on grass. Taste ants in the butter." By the time the first stars had appeared, the five outlaws were rolled into their comforters under the trees, listening to the soft night noises. A big white moon appeared over the Sunrise Mountains and sailed serenely through fluffs of white cloud. "Good night and good dreams," Muggles murmured sleepily. "Good dreams, everybody. Good night. Good dreams." "Queer thing," said Curly Green. "I don't remember ever really looking at the stars before. They're kind of comforting." "Mm-hmm." Sometime during the night, Muggles woke up, bewildered. Where was she? What was she doing on the ground instead of being in her own little house, snuggled into her own little bed? Then she saw the moon drifting high overhead and remembered. Propping her head up on one elbow, she looked around at the others. They were all peacefully asleep. It was an eerie feeling, waking up all alone in the night. She rolled over to look at the Sunset Mountains, looming so close in the west. A smoky mist hung over them, but there were no fires to be seen. "They've gone away," she thought sleepily. "The mushrooms, or whatever they are, have given up and gone off." With a yawn, Muggles settled herself down in her warm comforter and went back to sleep. And that is where we are going to end the live stream. Look at that, right at 9. I'm timing these really well. I did this last week too. Thank you everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed the drama. We've made it to the knoll. This is the second half of the book. And we got to see what happens from here. Spoiler alert, they have to build a new house. But we will let them duke out who does what coming up very soon. Thank you everybody for coming. Just as a reminder, we do this every Tuesday from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock Eastern time. This video will be edited and posted on my YouTube channel. There is a playlist of all of the previous chapters if you want to go listen to those, if you missed anything and you want to know what's going on with the story. Thank you everybody for coming, and I am going to go ahead and say goodbye for the evening. Bye.